People like you can help save lives. Book an appointment today at scottblood.co.uk.
After a challenging year in which international galleries, auction houses and museums have been forced to scale back their operations and make redundancies on an alarming scale, a slower, more considered approach to business seems to be emerging. So, are we into an era of longer, more in-depth exhibitions and bespoke events concerned more with authentic connection than flashy spectacle? I talked to Annie Shaw, a contributing editor at the Art newspaper. In the Netherlands, just as in the US, cuts by far-right politicians to international development are set to have a huge impact on arts projects. As TEFAF, the major international art fair, opens in the Dutch city of Maastricht, I talked to Shanae Bostash, our correspondent in Amsterdam, about fears of a funding crisis. And this episode's Work of the Week is one of the greatest paintings ever made, Hunters in the Snow from 1565 by Peter Bruegel the Elder. It's part of an exhibition called Archimboldo Bassano Bruegel, Nature's Time, which opened this week at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and the museum's director, Jonathan Fine, tells me more. Before all that, do take advantage of our new subscription offer. Enjoy 3 issues for just £3, $3 or €3. Subscribe before the 21st of March to start your subscription with the April bumper issue, including our Visitor Figures 2024 report and an Expo Chicago special. There's a link in the show notes. Please also subscribe to this podcast and our sister podcast, A Brush With, wherever you're listening. Do also give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Now, have you noticed fewer exhibitions opening in museums and shows running for months longer than they have in the past? It appears that this is a trend stretching across various sectors of the art world, from museums to commercial galleries, art fairs and auction houses. Annie Shaw has been looking into the phenomenon, and I spoke to her about what she found out. Annie, at the Art newspaper, we've been noticing something happening in museums, but more widely in the art world, and you've been tasked with reporting on it. Tell us what's going on.
Yes, so this has been something which I've observed, colleagues have observed over the past sort of year or so, last few months. Julia Halperin reported on this last summer in relation to US museums. But what we are seeing is this big slowdown. We're seeing a reduction in the number of exhibitions that are being put on every year, a sort of scaling back on the number of exhibitions, and then extension of the exhibitions that are being shown. So, some exhibitions are on for 7 or 9 months at the moment. And so the background to this phenomenon, I think it's really born out of some of the enormous challenges that the art world's faced over the past few years. I'd say really since the pandemic, if not, going back to Brexit, if we're looking at the UK. And I think it's important to acknowledge, as I do in the article, that we are seeing a great deal of redundancies across the board. More than 100 people have been let go at Sotheby's, scores of staff at the Guggenheim in New York, the Brooklyn Museum, the RA in London. Commercial galleries have closed, and even art fairs, I think, are really beginning to feel it. I reported on Eye of the Collector in London being put on pause this week. So just to say that I think this is an enormously difficult time for many in the art world. I would also say, Ben, that while the slowdowns that we've just been discussing are born out of necessity and the challenges that the art world has been facing, there is a genuine desire to also reassess how we engage in this industry. This idea that there were 400 art fairs a year, this merry-go-round that we were all sort of on. I think there's a real moment where people are looking structurally at how we go about things. I don't know if you remember during the pandemic, there was that slogan to build back better. I think it was a UK government slogan. And I remember hearing that in the art world a lot at the time, that we were going to come back in a healthier, more sustainable, more environmentally friendly manner. And of course, once lockdowns were lifted, we all bolted out of the gate and it was largely forgotten. But since then, we've had such a protracted period of economic and political turbulence. And in fact, there was an article in the New York Times today about how we are still living in the chaos of COVID. So it's almost like a long COVID effect. And some of those repercussions are still being felt. And I think this is just really giving rise to a moment where people are really assessing how they live their lives, how they go about business, so that they're more in tune with the current context, in tune with the planet and in tune with themselves.
Right. And it seems like the treatment is as complex as the initial problem, if you like, in the sense that there are multiple ways in which people are responding to it.
Yes, I think it is really a case-by-case scenario. The V&A in Dundee, for instance, has gone from 2 to 3 major exhibitions a year to just one 9-month-long show. And that's complemented by these shorter rolling exhibitions that take place in a separate gallery. So there are sort of 2 paces or 2 seasons, if you can say that, at that museum.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting case, isn't it? Because it's only 7 years old, that museum. And of course, like any museum that opened at the end of the last decade, they were hit very early on in their life with the pandemic. But still, if you think about it, setting a blueprint where you're going to do 3 exhibitions a year, and then within your first 7 years, completely ripping that up and effectively having a completely new way of programming seems to be quite a drastic action to a certain extent.
Yeah. I mean, if you think, as Leonie Bell, the director, said to me, they opened at the end of 2018. It was a completely different time. I mean, I feel like I've had 3 different lifetimes since 2019. Yeah. So, I suppose extreme times have called for quite extreme measures.
Indeed. And it's interesting how she phrases it, I think, that she says it's not about cost cutting, and we can talk about this in a minute, but it's this idea about remodelling in relation to context. And I think what she means is not just the environment economically, but the environment locally and so on. So just as you say, you've lived 3 different lifetimes, the visitors around V&A Dundee, the visitors that come to Dundee have now changed their lives and so on. And so I guess it's how organisations, institutions and so on are adapting to those individual circumstances and community circumstances effectively.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, I have to say, none of the people I really spoke to for the article described what they were doing as cost-cutting, although I think in the case of the V&A Dundee, that it was a preemptive move to protect their future programming and to protect their staff.
Right.
So there've been no redundancies there, and they've managed to protect them by, in a sense, sort of pulling back and reducing costs by, reducing exhibitions. But visitor habits are changing in museums and in galleries and indeed in art fairs around the world. I don't really know the Dundee context very well. It's a small city of 150,000. I think the museum relies a lot on local audiences. So there is a